Fáilte go féile starúil iar cochi, Ivera né, ach inis I Malia O'Halpin, for one night only. Worried Jack Eanes, fearful of the invasion, can rest easy. But you're all very welcome indeed to the first of this year's two West Cork History Festival events. My name's Simon Kingston, one of the two co-founders of the History Festival, and the other and superior co-founder is Victoria.
Thank you. Simon did mention that this is the first of two events. Just to give a quick plug, on the 9th of August, back in West Cork, which is obviously our homeland, we're doing an event with Dr. Sarah Lodge from the University of St Andrews and Miles Dungan, who many of you may know from the RTE History Show. They're both going to be talking about books they've written on 19th century history, fake news, propaganda, and true crime. So, if this is an exciting event, that's going to be even more exciting. Tickets on our website as from next week. So that's the plug for the next event. I'll hand back to Simon to introduce you to this event.
So I thought it was worth a word on the format of this evening. We have 5 panelists, and we're enormously grateful to all of them, but we're particularly grateful to Stephen Kelly, who has had to step in at very short notice to replace Connolly. Catherine, for reasons that are completely beyond her control, had to withdraw from the event at very short notice. She sends her apologies. She needs to attend, and she was happy for us to share this with you, the Sonny Jacobs funeral in Connemara. I'm sure you've all read about the tragic events there, so we completely understand her need to be in Connemara for that this evening. Nonetheless, we did want to have a reflection of the point of view that I think she would have brought us, and Stephen Kelly, who is the chairman of the Peace and Neutrality Alliance, will join us very shortly, and he will be part of the panel to do that. So when he arrives, and we'll welcome him when we come to that panel stage, please welcome somebody who is a dedicated and a willing representative of that cause, because he stepped in at the very last minute. But what we're going to do before we come to the panel discussion is invite 2 reflections on the issue of Ireland and neutrality. The first from Professor Eunan O'Halpin, Emeritus Professor of Contemporary Irish History at Trinity, talking a little bit about the policy of neutrality as an artifact of Irish state identity, as a pillar of foreign policy since independence, and what that might mean. So a vertical Irish, as it were, look at policy and neutrality as a policy. And then we are very fortunate to have Misha Glenny, who will come and talk to us with a contemporary perspective from other parts of Europe on this and related issues. So as it were, a horizontal view to complement the vertical view from Eunan. As I wrote that earlier, I thought it made sense, but maybe it conjures up an image that's too confusing. But anyway, a contemporary perspective from Europe. And then we will invite the 3 other panelists to join them, and we hope a lively and informed discussion will ensue. So if I can ask Eunan to come up first. Please welcome Eunan O'Halpin.
Thank you very much, Simon and Victoria, for inviting me. I need hardly remind you that I will need reminding after 15 minutes and 10 minutes, 20 minutes just to shut up. Neutrality in Ireland, it tends to be spoken of as though Ireland had a unique historical experience both before and after independence. So in what I'm going to talk about now, I'm going to make reference not only to Irish neutrality, but to the experience of other states who happened to be, if you like, Britain's neutral neighbours during the Second World War. So if that sounds a bit confusing, don't worry, it'll be even more confusing by the time I have finished. But because Britain, the United Kingdom, British Empire, rather, in the Second World War, was a very geospatially extended entity. It included not only the restless dominion of Ireland as it then was under the 1937 Constitution, with which Britain had a land border, but the British Empire had land borders with Iran, with Iraq, with Afghanistan, and to an extent also with China, but I won't talk much about China, but I will be making reference to how it is that some of these restless neighbours of the British Empire, of course Ireland, you could argue, was still in the Empire, fared during the Second World War, what this tells us about geopolitics at the time, but also to an extent for the present and for the future. Now, Simon said I was to talk about the Irish state and policy of neutrality. In some ways, that wouldn't take very long because it is not a matter on which the state has ever wished to dwell at any length, except to some extent before and during the Second World War, the Second World Emergency, as my English friend Mark Hennessy refers to it. I'm not sure if he's complimenting Ireland in saying that. But we have to remember that the narrative of the Irish state is the narrative of, if you like, it's a separatist narrative. It's breaking free from the ropes of cruel colonialism or whatever, which bound Ireland unhappily to the United Kingdom. And like all nationalist groups, those seeking Irish independence from, you could say, from the 16th century on, have looked to Britain's enemies. Right? That's what you naturally do. So straight away, those who wish to break away from a power are intrinsically say, well, how do we do it? We look to the enemies of this power. And the paradox of this is clear in Ireland, perhaps even clearer in Ireland than in many other places where independence groups fought and in some cases succeeded ultimately in achieving by physical force and combination of political pressure, succeeded in gaining independence from Britain or from the British Empire. And the paradox is brought out very well. In 2016, I was down outside the GPO, a century late, but at least I was there, to watch the two rival Republican, if you like, militant Republican displays, commemorative displays at Easter 2016. And at the second of these, which was the one run by Provisional Sinn Féin, they unfurled a banner which said, neither king nor Kaiser. So that was a reference to the citizen army, which of course wasn't at the time connected with Sinn Féin, and to its international socialist principles, and to the fact that the argument that James Connolly was then put forward is that the working class internationally, whoever they were, should not shed their blood for any imperial leader. And yet, 2 years later, where's James Connolly? He's in the GPO, right, fighting alongside others seeking independence, but with quite different ideologies and varied ideologies. What they have in common that they are fighting in association with, to quote the 1916 proclamation, a document which few people actually read carefully, but it does say in association with gallant allies in Europe. So where's neutrality where you're saying gallant allies in Europe, and how do advocates of neutrality as a historic position of the Irish sort of nationalist movement, how do they reconcile that with that phrase? I don't know is the answer. Perhaps in due course, when Mr. Kelly comes, we'll hear that. So there's always a paradox for nationalist movements, and they will look to their oppressor's enemy for help, even though that in turn involves often some kind of contractual relationship with the other. I mean, again, if you talk of 1916, if you're Roger Casement, Sir Roger Casement, as he was until the day of his execution, Casement, is in some ways rightly venerated as an early champion of human rights, of the rights of oppressed peoples, as the discloser of appalling treatment by European and to some extent South American, but of European origin, by colonialists of indigenous peoples, right? And yet he chooses to go to Germany, to Imperial Germany, which less than a decade before the First World War had been particularly associated in Southwest Africa, with which Casement was very familiar from his own consular career, with an absolutely hideous systemic genocide against the Herero people, right? So all the time, nationalists face this difficulty, and they try to square the circle. And all the time, if they face up to it, they fail. And this, of course, continues once Ireland gains independence, or some would say partial independence, once 26 counties of Ireland become a dominion in December 1922, the year after the treaty. The problem continues, because those many in Ireland who don't agree with the treaty, who want a republic and who want a 32-county all-Ireland republic, they continue to look outside to Britain's enemies and to some extent to the West enemies for support. And so you get the IRA in particular. Over time, it makes alliances. 1927 with the Soviet Union, it says that should the Soviet Union go to war with Britain, they will stand beside the Soviet Union. Now, this doesn't necessarily matter hugely, but it's what they say. In the 1930s, Republicans variously, but primarily, flirt, first of all, to an extent, a small minority perhaps, through the Comintern and so on, with the Soviet Union. That's in some ways more ideological perhaps than practical. But from 1936 on, mainstream hardline Republicans look primarily to Nazi Germany. And as the full horrors of Nazi Germany begin to become apparent even before the war proper, the enthusiasm for Germany amongst perhaps a small minority of the IRA leadership increases, not decreases. My great uncle, Jim O'Donovan, was the architect ultimately of the link between the IRA and the Nazis in 1939-40. And although an intellectual, and as he saw himself a liberal intellectual, he never apologized, he never regretted. A link with Hitler was fine if it was a link against Britain, even though he saw himself in Irish political terms as somebody on the left. And that's again a classic example of the paradox of, it's not particular to Ireland, but of nationalist movements. They will somehow, the ideology of who might help you doesn't matter as long as they'll help you against your principal enemy. And it's out of that sort of thinking, it seems to me, that Irish neutrality to a large extent, as what has become a doctrine, has arisen. It's been neutrality in a sense against Britain, right? And while militants will take this step, as Jim O'Donovan did, of forging a link with Nazi Germany in hopes that if the Nazis could be persuaded and if the opportunity was right, as it appeared to be in summer of 1940, that Britain might be directly attacked, attempts might be there to invade it, that the IRA would support German operations in Ireland. Now, in practice, the Republican movement attempted very ineptly, but did attempt to support mainly German espionage through Ireland on Britain, which itself was a very serious security threat, not only to Ireland, but to Irish independence, because it was a danger of provoking the British into action to crush this threat. And the only way that threat and the associated threats of being in a war zone were addressed by the Irish government was by extensive, largely secret, covert cooperation in relation to matters pertaining to IRA activities, to German activities, the diplomatic legations here, and so on, but also just copious, again, largely undeclared, but obvious cooperation in matters like to do with the safety of shipping, to do with air movements, you name it, you name it, you name it. Because all Ireland as a neutral could do to try to keep it was to try to keep the nearest belligerent sweet, right, as a practice. And if you look at Iraq, if you look at Iran, if you look at Egypt, and if you look at Afghanistan, as I mentioned, those four states, what they tried to do in precisely the same time, to different degrees and with differing degrees of success, the Afghans most successfully, was to keep the nearest dangerous belligerent sweet. And you did that by all sorts of cooperation, which in themselves were plainly, on the face of it, though you didn't acknowledge it, an absolute departure from neutrality, right? So you stay neutral by not being neutral. If we look at the European neutrals in 1939, which I'm not that old, but in 1939, in Europe, about 27 states, September 39, said, we're not in this war. Within a few years, all but 5, and 6 if we include the Vatican, right? retained that status. A few went to war opportunistically, Hungary, Romania, as the thing, Italy. In June 1940, once it looked once the French were beaten, the Italians joined the fight. But most of them were drawn into the war by circumstances, by the fact in 1940, as De Valera courageously pointed out, when the Netherlands was attacked and Belgium was attacked, these were neutrals, and yet Germany had no hesitation in overrunning them. The Swedes in Scandinavia, the Swedes stayed out of the war, but they stayed out of the war partly by being extraordinarily obsequiously helpful to Germany, including facilitating the German invasion of Norway, Sweden's neighbors, right? The Finns, well, the Finns had a complicated history because the Soviet Union attacked them in the autumn of 1939 by a tacit agreement with Germany, but yet the Finns end up fighting. From 41 on, they fight with Germany against the Soviet Union, right? Because they're perhaps I shouldn't talk too much about Finland. But so small countries, as Ireland is a small country, as I don't have to tell you, and neutral countries, the only way that they can retain their, if you like, political independence has historically in the 20th century has been, as I say, being polite to the nearest neighbor. You could call it the nearest neighboring bully. You can't do it simply by talking of principles. You can't do it simply by pointing to the UN Charter or the Charter of the League of Nations or whatever. You do it by saying, look, we're staying out of this, but of course we'll accommodate you because your interests and our interests are coterminous, and are because you're next door and you're bloody powerful. You control our lifelines anyway, and if we don't deal with you quietly, you know, we will have no choice, and we have no choice. Now, at the political level, before and during the Second World War, neutrality was articulated, particularly by Eamon de Valera, very clearly as a principle in international. A principle rather than not an anti-British principle. He said that small states have big wars are bad for small states and for small independent states. We wish to find different ways of resolving international disputes and so on and so on. We'll adhere by the rule of law. We'll do all these kind of things, right? And to some extent, the Irish state has consistently taken that position in policy terms. And so we support the United Nations. We contribute to peacekeeping, we do this, that, and the other. And we couch these in very principled terms. But De Valera was able to maintain neutrality only by persuading the British that a neutral Ireland wouldn't damage British interests, as he had first said in Philadelphia in 1920. And secondly, more importantly, by persuading the Americans, who were much more hostile to Irish neutrality, even when they themselves were neutral. Roosevelt was much more critical of Ireland staying out of the war and less understanding than even Winston Churchill was, right? But what you do is you cooperate quietly in all sorts of ways with these adjacent powers. Because the United States is an adjacent power as an Atlantic power. Obviously, we don't have a land border with them, but we do share a sea. So to move on, Chair, because I'm sure I've gone on too long already. After the Second World War, as the Cold War begins to develop, because of politics domestically here, you get in 1948 a very curious sort of anti-Fianna coalition, a five-party coalition, what known as the Inter-Party Government under John A. Costello. Now, Costello was the head of the Fine Gael Party, which is also known as the Commonwealth Party, very, seen as the winners of the Civil War, but also as relatively unbelligerent in relation to Northern Ireland, and generally a kind of a conservative, let's not stir the boat kind of party. But for various reasons, his Minister for External Affairs came from a new, small, radical Republican party, Clonla Poblachtha, and that was Sean McBride. And McBride in 1949, as you probably all know, famously stated the Irish position in relation when there was talk of Ireland being invited to join NATO, the new North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which of course is still with us. And McBride couched Irish refusal to join NATO explicitly and in a sense solely, not in terms of international law, not in terms of the rights of small nations and the needs of small nations and, you know, the Pacific settlement of disputes. He couched it solely in terms of Northern Ireland remaining a part of the United Kingdom. And in fact, MacBride went further in private. He saw the Council of Europe, which we now think of it, you know, in utterly different terms. He saw that as a possible defence alternative, whereby Ireland could make military arrangements with European mainland powers for defence purposes. He was obsessed at the time with the protection of Christian civilization from Bolshevism. He changed his tune later on. He got the Lenin Peace Prize in the 1970s. But at the time he also approached the Americans directly, and again secretly, and this only came out in the 1980s, but he approached them directly for a bilateral Irish US Defence Pact, right? So although by the time I was a student in the 70s, some of you may remember the 1970s, MacBride was a patron saint of neutralist Ireland, and in some ways of a pacifist Ireland almost. He had been chief of staff of the IRA, unlike other people. But the point is, when he was in government, he was secretly pursuing arrangements with in a sense, the very devil, the United States, defense arrangements. So over time, views changed, and the actual, what states actually do, and what they're, particularly in diplomacy and in security matters, what their officials actually do, as distinct from what is publicly stated, there's often a very wide gap between them. And I think in Ireland, the gap is particularly wide between the realities of how Ireland has remained neutral in defence and security terms versus the rhetoric. And the rhetoric, in some ways, on the sort of moral issues, have I finished? Nearly finished. I've gone in completely different directions. Okay, is there anything more I want to say? Yes, there's an awful lot more I want to say. Just to go briefly to move forward, issues like joining the EC, which became obviously now the EU, as early as I think 1961, the then Taoiseach said this. Obviously, he saw the become the European Union as, to some extent, a security construct, right? And he said over time Ireland will have to adjust to that. Now, it didn't follow that Ireland didn't have to. That Ireland should abandon military neutrality, but he did see that Ireland couldn't join a body which was going to be, if you like, a social and economic construct, but a construct built to strengthen Western Europe vis-a-vis the East, rather than simply, you know, that was the defining principle. That's why the United States, as Trump forgets, actually put money into Europe to form what becomes the European Union. Lemass acknowledged that publicly, although there was a bit of rumbling in the ranks at the time. But the rumbling at the time and throughout the 60s was largely to do, and even into the 70s, wasn't to do so much with the sort of East-West context, but there remained the subtext of a united Ireland, right? If the Brits were out of Ireland, things might be different. But that's perhaps where I leave you, because I was in fact at a talk here about 3 years ago. There's an ongoing study group, I think called ARENS, looking at the possibilities of a united Ireland and what it might mean. And they've quite rightly looked at social policy, they've looked at agriculture, they look at energy, right? They look at the rights of the elderly, hooray. They look at respect for minorities, they do all this. And the one question they haven't gone near is what? It's what would you say to the people of Northern Ireland in terms of how would you say, we will protect your security, we will protect your skies, we will protect the seas around you more effectively as a neutral, unarmed island than you are currently protected, say in Northern Ireland, as part of the United Kingdom, a power which has a seat at the UN Security Council, a power which has a functioning Air Force, which has a functioning Navy, which is, it's a major military power, and it has some deterrent capacity and some history of defending itself, whether we like it or not. So do you want to join United Ireland, where all that will be gone? And in United Ireland, we'll hear from Mark Mellett and others of the realities of Ireland. We think of We don't get invaded by land because we're an island on the edge of Europe. But the seas around us, the skies around us, the trade on which we rely, the communications on which we rely, these all have to be defended. And currently, and for 100 years nearly, Ireland has never even attempted to defend the 26 county portions of itself from any kind of external aggression. So how would we persuade anybody in their right mind in Northern Ireland to join this defenceless and sometimes rather wet and gloomy new entity, which we're all in favour of, I'm sure. Thank you.
Paraphrase and summarise, be a grand little country if you could just put a roof on it. So one perspective there, and there will be a chance to return to some of that. But now, as promised, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to welcome Misha Glenny. Misha Glenny, I'm sure, will be familiar to many of you as a long-time BBC correspondent covering Central and Eastern Europe with considerable eclat and with authority. But he's also, as fewer of you may know, the rector of the IWM, the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. So comes to us as at the head of a group of advanced scholars there as well. And we've asked Misha to, having listened to that historical view of neutrality as a policy, whether in the breach or not, to offer us some perspectives on Europe today with relation to neutrality. Misha.
Thank you very much, Simon. If you see me fiddling with my iPhone, it's not because I'm doing my emails while doing this, it's because I'm checking on the timing, so I don't go on too long either. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful to the West Cork History Festival for inviting me here. I think this is the first time it's gone on tour. But I have to confess, although from my accent you'll detect that I was probably brought up in the south of England, you'd be right, in London and Oxford. I am in fact also, by dint of the foresight of my grandfather on my paternal side, who was born in Newry, County Down, an Irish citizen as well. Very, very, very pleased so to be, especially after 2016. Neutrality. So as Simon pointed out, I'm the rector of the IWM in Vienna, and I want to start there with Vienna because I'm going to argue that each neutral country has its own very specific path to neutrality and its own very specific understanding of neutrality, but that we now have to reassess those neutralities because the concept of neutrality in Europe itself has changed fundamentally since 2016, but I would say most definitively since the 20th of January of this year, and I will explain what I mean in a minute. So I want to start with Austria. Austria is a country which by treaty is deemed to be permanently neutral. That was the state treaty agreed by the nascent Austrian government and the four occupying powers of Austria, the Soviet Union, Britain, the United States, and France. Austria had been under occupation since 1945 by those four powers. Vienna was divided into four sectors, not all contiguous, interestingly enough. And the center of Vienna, the first district, was under the international control. All four powers had jurisdiction there. Austrians themselves managed to persuade, or the Austrian government managed to persuade the four occupying powers that Austria had also been occupied between 1938 and 1945, proclaiming itself and underlined by the state treaty as Hitler's first victim. This later on became a contentious issue which flared up in the mid-1980s. The first big story that I walked into as a stringer in Vienna in 1986, which was the Waldheim affair, which led to Austria fundamentally reassessing its relationship with Nazi Germany, and perhaps this idea that Austria was merely Hitler's first victim was, shall we say, a sort of TikTok version of events rather than a really thorough understanding of that relationship between the Austrians and Nazism. But Austrian neutrality isn't only informed by its experience with Nazism and the fact that it had been under four-power occupation for 10 years. It was also informed by the collapse and failure of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of the First World War. Interestingly, today, Austria is the only major European or Euro-Asian empire where there is absolutely no nostalgia whatsoever for empire, other than a sort of Disneyfied version, which is embodied by their obsession with Sisi, Elizabeth. I won't go into that. But there is no political interest in restoring Austrian imperial designs whatsoever. But neutrality has been very important to the Austrians since 1955 because of their experience as a failed empire, as part of the Nazi project, and as being under four-power occupation, with the fear that a significant chunk of Austria might have come under Soviet control in the way that was the case with Germany, but also that Vienna itself might be divided. And what this has led to is a consensus in Austria, which is not dissimilar to Ireland, that neutrality is a really great and important thing. After the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, it was fascinating to watch what happened in neutral countries. I'm going to restrict my remarks at the moment to those on the European landmass. The speed with which, not so much Finland, which didn't surprise me, they have experience of fighting the Soviets, so they have experience of fighting Russians. The speed with which Finland, but really strikingly, the speed with which Sweden decided that they wished to jettison their neutrality and apply for NATO membership was really striking. It was done and dusted domestically within a matter of days. About the same amount of time was devoted by the Austrian political establishment and the Austrian people to the discussion of whether Austria should abandon its neutrality. And without hesitation, across the political spectrum, they all say, no, we remain neutral. Now, Austria had in the 1970s and 1980s very successfully engineered that neutrality to restore its importance, to give it a role in Europe and in international affairs. It's often forgotten now that Vienna is really very central, right slap bang in the middle of Europe. You're 2.5 hours from Budapest, you're 3.5 hours from Prague, you're an hour from Bratislava. You're 4 hours from Zagreb, 7 hours from Belgrade, 5 hours from Munich, or 4.5 from Munich. It is really central, but during the Cold War, if you look at a map, it's significantly further east than Prague. And so it was sticking in to the Warsaw Pact territories. And then you got to the border. And so it became a real backwater. Bruno Kreisky, really the outstanding figure of Austrian post-war politics, wanted to do something about this. And so what he succeeded in doing is, first of all, he persuaded international organizations to come to Vienna. And so large organizations from the United Nations, the United Nations Organization on Drugs and Crime, for example, the IAEA came, which is very important. Indeed, later on, the OSCE had its headquarters in Vienna. OPEC had its headquarters in Vienna. And what that meant is that Vienna re-established itself as the city of spies and espionage. Everyone came to Vienna to find out what was going on with everyone else, and very entertaining it was too. And the Austrians see this actually as a positive and not a negative. And then they found, after 1989, that they are back in the center of Europe, and that role as a political, diplomatic, and espionage crossroads is actually tremendously advantageous to Austria and Vienna revives. The city today is the fastest growing capital in the European Union. It now has over 2 million people. It is wealthy. It's extremely well organized, thanks to 120 years of visionary social democratic governance, with the exception, of course, of the period 1934 to 1945. And there is still this powerful consensus amongst social democrats, amongst the Austrian People's Party, and the far-right Freedom Party, that Austria must remain neutral in order to retain this status, which is why it differs from Finland and Sweden. The other thing, I want to back up what Eunan was saying about Sweden during the Second World War. The other thing, of course, that Sweden was doing at this time was supplying the Nazis with a lot of weapons. They were a big arms manufacturer and not neutral in that sense. So Austria's neutrality is grounded in what they believe to be a political, diplomatic advantage for them as a small country with not a great deal of leverage externally elsewhere. One of the consequences of this is that a lot of Russian money after 1989, and indeed a lot of oligarchic money from other parts of the world, started coming into Vienna. Its dependency on Russian energy sources was the highest in Europe when February 2022 came along, and Austrian industry and business, particularly the Austrian People's Party, were very reluctant to join in with sanctions and those sorts of things. They did, but they have been very slow to readjust their economy, where the Germans, for example, were very quick. So for the Austrians, there is a huge mythology around neutrality. Incidentally, in the state treaty also explicitly forbids Austria from joining any form of union, politically or economically, with Germany. It's broken that rule because it's joined the European Union. And so its argument, which it still trots out regularly, that it has to remain neutral because of the state treaty, well, there's precedent that can break that. I want to move on now briefly to where we stand after the Russian invasion, the full-scale Russian invasion of February 2022, and then also the election of Donald Trump this year for a second term as president, and his strategy towards Europe, towards Russia, and towards China. Because I believe those two events together mean that the idea of neutrality in Europe has changed fundamentally. It is a different concept now. Austria is contributing. I don't know about whether Ireland is doing the same. Austria is contributing to the purchase of weaponry for Ukraine through the European, ironically titled European Peace Fund. So some money does flow to Ukraine, but it has been insistent that it will support Ukraine politically, but that it will not directly fund the defense of Ukraine. And it's being consistent in that, and it hasn't. But politically, there is a growing part of Austria which is worried that it is de facto benefiting from the NATO umbrella, and that at some point NATO is going to will stop providing that umbrella, and within, and this is going on outside of public debate and inside the Austrian government, civil service and military, there have been commitments to start joining in satellite communications shields and other technical issues which look technical but are in fact defense security mechanisms, so that Austria is signaling to its NATO allies that it is prepared actually to contribute to some extent to the defense of Europe. But the fact is that after Ukraine and the problem for NATO and Europe during the Biden administration, which was a different problem from the problem it faces now. With the Biden administration, we saw the implementation of what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, referred to as boiling the frog strategy, which was to give the Ukrainians enough weapons to defend themselves from Russia, so not to be defeated by Russia, but not to give them enough weaponry to actually lead to a collapse or defeat of Russia. Biden's overwhelming concern about the war in Ukraine was the prospect of Russia with its 5,000 plus nuclear warheads collapsing into chaos and possibly even fragmentation. That was the issue as far as the Americans were concerned. In the meanwhile, as a happy coincidence, the American weapons industry received a real shot in the arm because of all the weapons that the Americans were supplying to the Ukrainians. And at the same time, what do you know, they were also benefiting from selling energy to Europe because the Europeans could no longer import gas from Russia, so it was buying American gas at 4 times the price. So actually, Biden's strategy for Ukraine was win-win for the United States, and all the while Russia was depleting itself, exposing its military capacity as being much less effective than everyone had imagined. So for the Americans, actually, Biden, from an American domestic perspective, Biden's approach to the Ukraine war was very successful. But now, and here I'll start winding up, we have an American president who is Donald Trump, who is much more confident, much more clear about what he wants to do, even if his style remains defined by chaos and uncertainty. Donald Trump, and I suspect a large part of the American establishment, have decided that Europe is actually a hindrance to what they are trying to do, and they would much prefer to make a deal with Russia. If they can, they would come to an agreement with China over Taiwan, but they see China as their primary competitor. And we see that competition above all else in technology. Europe is limping behind both China and United States in technological development, including in military development. As we know, there's been a big discussion here in Europe now about how you respond to the Americans, and that we have to put a lot more money into the arms industry and so on. Worth reminding briefly that the United States spends almost $1 trillion a year on weaponry, that China spends just over 300 billion a year on weaponry. Europe spends 500 billion a year on weaponry. That's the European Union, and you can throw the United Kingdom in on top of that as well, which is a very, very significant amount. But the political understanding of how defense in Europe should operate is still extremely fragmented and uncertain. But what Europe has to understand now is that NATO, as the primary alliance of Europe and the United States, is, if not de jure, it is de facto dead or dying. And that's why neutrality is no longer the same thing that it used to be. So when considering neutrality, whether you're Ireland, whether you're Austria, and whether you're Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, what you're considering is neutrality in a different geopolitical age, where Europe is squeezed between China, between the United States, between an aggressive and to some extent unpredictable Russia, where the tactics of warfare are going to change fundamentally. And I end up with the issue which I know that the Irish are familiar with, and that is the undersea cables issue. If Russia decides that it wants to punish the United Kingdom, for example, for explicitly, or what the Russians claim is explicit aid to Ukraine for its latest operation, Operation Spiderweb, the Russians have accused Britain of being behind this, then one of the easiest things they can do, and we've seen this happen around the world now, is cut the undersea cables upon which all of our communications depend. And whether Ireland likes it or not, it will suffer as a consequence of that, because Ireland is using the same cables as the United Kingdom and indeed the rest of Europe. So I haven't yet decided myself whether it's rational, whether it's the right thing to do for Ireland or Austria to leave their neutrality and become part of NATO. But if they do become part of NATO, it is a very, very different NATO from the one that was set up in 1949 or expanded in the 2000s with the East European and Balkan countries that have subsequently joined. And I'll finish there.
Misha, thank you. And thank you for being willing to attend the West Cork History Festival, even though it turned out to be in Dublin, which must have been a disappointment early on. I'll invite the other three panelists to join us on the stage. Patrick Keatinge, Emeritus Associate Professor of Political Science at Trinity College Dublin. We'll then put Stephen next, if we may. And I'll come back to the particular debt of thanks we owe Stephen. Well, okay, we can go in a moment, and then Mark. So, Patrick, I've already introduced, leading expert on Irish international relations and Irish foreign policy. I think will be able to give us that view. Stephen Kelly, relatively recently elected chair of PANA, the Peace and Neutrality Alliance, and who has nobly stepped into the breach left by Catherine Connolly's departure, for which, again, she and we apologize. It would not have been our intent to face you with a panel comprised entirely of males of the species. Catherine would have been here had it not been for the tragic events in Connemara. But we're enormously grateful to Stephen for stepping in at very short notice. And then finally, at the far end, we have Mark Mellett. Mark is Vice Admiral retired of the Irish Naval Service, and between 2015 and 2022, I think 2015 and 2021, was Chief of Staff of the Defence Forces in Ireland, so can speak, I think, with real authority about their posture and the threats as the defence sector faces them. I'm going to move to that chair now, so you can all take a deep breath while I do that. So I'm going to ask, to begin with, the three speakers who haven't yet had a chance to speak, to offer a perspective on sort of where they come to this discussion of Irish neutrality today from. Are we at a moment where we need to avoid a slippery slope into a kind of militarism that is the antithesis of Irish identity and Irish self-expression in the world? Or are we, rather, having to recognize that gravity applies to us in a way that perhaps we have had some insulation from in the past? Perhaps that's the wrong phrasing of the question, but if I could ask, and we'll begin in order, so begin, if I may, with Stephen. Just give us 5 minutes, Stephen, of where you and Hannah come to this discussion from.
Okay, well, thanks very much for having me. I mean, we were founded almost 30 years ago to advocate for the right of Irish people to their own independent foreign policy, with positive neutrality as its key component. So it won't surprise you to learn that where we stand on this, we think we are in a very slippery slope, and we should, I mean, obviously as a minimum remain outside of NATO, but in addition to that, we support withdrawal from the NATO Partnership for Peace, and generally an opt-out from EU militarization, similar to what was once enjoyed by Denmark. That would be, at a high level, what we stand for. I think that the main issue confronting us at the moment is the triple lock. Our position is that we favour the triple lock remaining in place, in line with the outcome of the 2002 and 2009 referendums. And we think it's the best safeguard existing at the moment, keeping us outside of what we would regard as potentially disastrous foreign wars. I think there was nothing I necessarily, I mean, Eunan O'Halpin is obviously an expert in the area and gave a very comprehensive overview, but I think that the idea, like the IRA's role was quite marginal in terms of broader Irish society. I think about 2 or 3 Irish people in total ever fought for the Nazis in terms of actually signing up, and I think there were people who were prisoners of war. John Duggan's book, Neutral Ireland and the Third Reich, records 165,000 Irish people, I think that includes the North, but who had next of kin Irish addresses serving for the Allies in the war. I think that it is true that a small country on its own does have to placate its neighbour in a way, but there's strength in unity. And what I would argue we need is positive neutrality that's based on drawing on the strengths of small countries across the world. And that's what the United Nations enables us to do. That's what the League of Nations unsuccessfully provided a platform to do. I mean, we were one of the first post-colonial countries to be in the League of Nations. It was the platform from which De Valera strongly condemned the invasion of Ethiopia by Italy, and at a time when the League of Nations Charter was really shredded by the major powers, he was, and Ireland was one of the only countries that really took it seriously. And it was Sean Lester from, who was a Protestant Irish Republican, and he was the last Secretary General of the League of Nations, and he remained dutifully at his post in Switzerland with the war in Europe raging around him. So I think that whilst it's true that NATO, not joining NATO, the kind of proximate issue was partition, the converse that we would have joined NATO had it not been partition doesn't necessarily hold. Because in 1951, De Valera was asked this specific question. I think it was in London, and he said, well, that's a hypothetical question, we can't answer it. That would depend on what a united Ireland would actually say. And I would push back slightly at the idea that maybe neutrality was purely reactive and negative in that sense, because from 1956 onwards, there was a clearly enunciated policy by Liam Cosgrave, and I think that he set it out, that there would be three principles governing Irish policy, which was scrupulous fidelity to the United Nations Charter, not coming under the influence of any bloc, and support for Christian civilization, which obviously was relevant in a Cold War context, but less so since the fall of communism. So what we look for is to return to the days when Ireland was advocated a positive neutrality, as seen in the actions of Frank Aiken and Frederick Boland before the United Nations, bringing forward the first Irish resolutions, which helped contribute to the Treaty of Non-Proliferation. And I think with the way the world is going at the moment, nuclear non-proliferation in particular is something that is ever more important and that requires the support of small countries like Ireland.
Patrick, can I ask you the same question?
Yes. Okay. Slippery slope, certainly. We've been on the slippery slope for the last 50 years or so. When I first came into looking at neutrality as a subject of research, this was in the early 60s, I guess, and I tended to find a comparative approach was helpful. The other European neutrals at the time were a mixed bunch, as Misha says, the Austrian position he's described. Originally, Austria was supposed to follow the Swiss model in institutional terms at any rate, but the Swiss were not interested in joining anything at that time, and they only joined the UN in 2002. And the Swiss were different from us because they were armed to the teeth. And the Austrians armed themselves pretty seriously. The Swedes also had an armaments industry, considered shortly after the war and possibly going nuclear. The Swedes also considered shortly after the war in forming a regional military alliance in the Baltic region and got beaten to it by NATO. The Finns couldn't really do anything because they were trapped in their friendship with the Soviet Union. So it was an interesting spectrum, but we were outside even all of that because we insisted on applying to join the European community. And proper neutrals didn't do that sort of thing at all. Misha has explained some of the Austrian response, but there also was the problem that the European community was designed to exist in time of war and to take decisions collectively, and that went against the notion of the individual rights of a neutral. Lemass said if European integration goes in the direction of a military alliance, we'll have to consider it. And he was perfectly ready to accept ending neutrality if that was the case. But it never did reach that direction. Why? Because of NATO. The other member states of the European community wished to make NATO the primary source of their security for a simple reason. NATO included the United States, the guys who had all the guns. And that's been the position right up to now. And it, of course, raises the interesting questions that Misha did on the change in NATO. Even if the United States were to formally leave NATO, they've already screwed up the credibility of the commitment, the Article 5 commitment, because nobody believes Trump will do anything he says one day from the next. So anyway, I think it's important in the Irish case to dwell on the fact that our desire to join European integration for economic reasons is probably the central foreign policy interest. And that interest could contradict the continuation of having a neutral version of foreign policy. And that leads me, final point I would make is to reflect on the curious way we discuss these matters. We have two parallel circles of discussion, if you like. You have the people who are interested in the preservation of NATO and the people who are interested in the defense of the state and its people. And we tend to talk across each other in that respect. We're going to have a wonderful jumping up and down from PANA and its friends on the preservation of the triple lock next week or so for some time. And we have the professionals, the military professionals who are pragmatic and pessimistic people on the whole, because they have to consider threats and vulnerabilities, and they are making an overdue attempt to get to grips with this. I mean, in the last few years, but we're going to have to pour an awful lot of money at it, and we are now facing Trump, who is not a person who is making an awful lot of money a likely achievement by anybody, even Trump. So there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, to consider. I myself am a pessimistic and pragmatic sort of individual. I'm not a military man. I failed that a long time ago. I managed to reassemble a Bren gun and leaving the firing pin out, and that was the end of.
Patrick, thank you. So inadvertent pacifism. It's very. I should, for the people at the back. Stephen's staying remarkably static just at the moment, so he's not jumping up and down yet. But maybe we can put the same question, Mark, to you as a a pessimistic pragmatist, as Patrick would have you. Can you answer that question?
Okay, just to, was it your fault? Because I was in the FCA, and that Bren gun I got had no firing pin in it. So, but that's where my career started, actually, before I joined the Permanent Defence Forces. But I suppose on the historical side, there's a wonderful paper by Gareth Fitzgerald, and it's an article in the Irish Times in 1999. I think he calls it the 3 myths of Irish neutrality. And I think the key point he makes is that we were not neutral in the Second World War. And I think Eunan, you kind of touched on that. We were not neutral in the context of NATO. In fact, we were interested in joining NATO, but we overplayed our hand in the context of Northern Ireland. And when we were joining the EC, it was generally accepted there would be a common security and defence policy element to it that in due course we would have to sign up to. But even roll back to the Treaty of 1921 in Article 6, which said until we had the wherewithal, and I'm paraphrasing, to provide for our own coastal defence, it would be provided by His Majesty's Imperial Forces. So while we didn't have a military alignment, you know, to say that we were militarily non-aligned is probably an overstatement, because we were effectively saying our maritime jurisdiction would be secured and defended by His Majesty forces. And in that time, then, I suppose a veil of sea blindness came down on the state that has prevailed right up to recent years. Meanwhile, back at Europe, I think the reality is that we all acknowledge, notwithstanding the Balkan Wars and right up to the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation, we've had a period of extraordinary peace. And that was built on the vision of the likes of Robert Schuman, but it was also built on the interest of the US in Europe, starting with the Marshall Plan, which saw $15 billion put into Europe in the context of reconstruction, and then an interest for the decades that followed up to recent administrations. And now the game has changed. We no longer have that certainty in terms of security in Europe, and all we need to do is look at recent events in terms of the emerging types of threats. Whether we like it or not, the HSE cyber attack emanated from the Russian Federation jurisdiction. And that was a terrible onslaught onto our institutions and its state. We will never know what the price was in terms of dysfunctionality of our health services, but it was an act which was not compatible with normal institutions. We've also seen more recently the intention to expand the Russian Federation embassy in Orwell Road, a massive expansion of 500%, thankfully arrested to a particular point. We have evidence and reports of Russian Federation agents interfering with Oireachtas members. And then we had in the, I think it was touched on by Misha, the February 22 act of a suggestion that Russian Federation were going to carry out an exercise in an area where Ireland has sovereign rights for 5 days and effectively appropriate an area the size of Wexford, Wicklow and Dublin. Not just the sea area, but the air domain above, to a point where the Irish Aviation Authority had to issue a notice to air mariners to stay out of the area because of artillery and missile firings. And that, I suppose, indicates how things have changed. So in terms of neutrality, I'm firmly of the view we have not been neutral. I will accept the point that we have been militarily non-aligned largely since the foundation of the state. And into the future, we are really going to have to look at how we deal with some capabilities in terms of our state, the deficits in terms of air and maritime in particular, but our defence forces as a whole in general. And the final point I would say is, you know, in terms of defence, defence is inextricably linked with sovereignty. You know, I suppose the bedrock of our sovereignty is built on our defence forces, and they provide the framework for the institutions of a functioning state where people are free, where the institutions of state function, and where the vulnerable are protected. And if you don't make that investment in defence, you don't have what should follow then is the security of institutions of a state that is part of, in the case of the region, a multilateral framework of the European Union, and also a country that believes in human rights and norms and principles that are about the institutions of good governance and civilized society.
Thank you. Stephen, I'd love to give you a chance to come back on a couple of points. I mean, in sometimes in this discussion, defense, security, and neutrality are all treated as if they were synonyms. You mentioned in your comments that your position would be that that Ireland's security should be maintained in solidarity, as it were, with other states with shared values. How would that work in the face of some of the threats we've heard about? How would that security be achieved, and with what?
Well, by whatever is within our means, and that's through diplomacy is the strongest weapon that we have. Obviously, there's the military dimension, and we have seen that with Russia's invasion, but we also need to avoid collapsing the distinction between military and non-military threats. I think there has been a sort of collapsing of that distinction in a lot of discourse that's happened. There's a language around hybrid warfare, and everything seems to be war, like misinformation, so for things like misinformation get subsumed under the rubric of warfare, the same with cyber attacks and so forth. And I think it's very dangerous to be treating all of these things as military threats. They're threats, and there are military threats as well, but they're not the same. So I think that we need to try and avoid threat inflation. I think that, there's been a huge amount of discourse around the subsea cables, and clearly they're very important for our infrastructure, but they're privately owned, and I would suggest that it's for their owners primarily to protect. They're already benefiting from very favorable tax treatment. So whilst there's a threat there, I don't see it, quite frankly, as being a military issue for us to protect them. I think that our military is there to defend our country as a first line of defense. There's no realistic way we would ever be able to inflict an outright defeat on an aggressor. I think the only small country in the world could do that is North Korea, and I think that would be a pretty hard sell. So I think that when you look at the accomplishments of the United Nations and other international institutions, whilst it's very easy to be cynical, by many benchmarks, they have been remarkably successful. I mean, the United Nations was founded to prevent a third world war, and after 80 years, it has succeeded so far. And so I think there's that, and I think that the world would be a far, far worse place without those sorts of institutions.
Misha, as you listen to that, I mean, how, as you're anatomizing the situation, do you differentiate between military and non-military threats in the way Stephen was?
Well, it's they are different. They are different types of threats, but they have security implications. So what we have seen in Central Europe, for example, is really significant disinformation campaigns, which we know are coming from Russia. They've been traced back to Russia. In order to influence electorates. They were nearly successful in Romania. They have had an influence on the recent Slovak election, which Robert Fico won. And the reason why these are so significant is that the hard right in Europe often have a relationship with Putin and with Russia. It's important to note that in today's political spectrum, there is not a full consensus on NATO. There is not a full consensus on supporting Ukraine at all. The Russians are well aware of this, and they do everything they can to try and influence public opinion in countries across Europe. And I'm sure they wouldn't be against trying to do it in Ireland. I don't know if there have been any cases, if they felt that this was in their political and security interest. What I think it's worth remembering in terms of our relationship with Russia and with Central Europe is two things. One, that this period of peace that we've experienced in Europe, with one or two anomalies like the former Yugoslavia, since 1945, was posited largely on the Cold War and on Yalta. So whenever you had revolutions or uprisings in Eastern Europe, whether 56 in Hungary, 68 in Poland, 80-81 I beg your pardon, 68 in Czechoslovakia, 80-81 in Poland, quite specifically with Hungary and with Czechoslovakia, the Soviet leadership contacted the American leadership to be assured that Yalta still stands. And in both cases, the American says yes. And one of the reasons for this, for the rest of Europe, is that these territories between Russia and Germany are the neuralgic territories of Europe. They're called the bloodlands for a reason. And what happens after 1989, and everything that gets thrown up in the air again, is that those territories become potentially neuralgic again, and this has now happened with Ukraine, and this is another central point which is changing the nature of neutrality and the debates within Central Europe about how one shores up one's own security. The only thing I'd say to Stephen about the UN is that the UN is increasingly powerless. Its legitimacy is being undermined by a number of major powers, now very significantly by the United States, and it simply doesn't have the authority, it doesn't have the financial ability to influence matters in the way that it has done in the past. And so I'm not saying that, you know, the UN isn't important, and nuclear non-proliferation is incredibly important in my opinion, although it's being slowly eroded, and in the Middle East we're seeing a really significant, and between India and Pakistan, danger of something happening. The first strike principle is out the window. Russia has said it will consider using at least tactical battlefield nuclear weapons against Ukraine. And so this environment is very, very different from the environment that existed when neutrality had a real coherence and a purpose, which I appreciate. It's just, we're not in Kansas anymore.
Mark, Stephen has a point though, doesn't he? I mean, Ireland on its own, however well provisioned, could not defeat major threats. So what is it? I mean, first of all, tell us a little bit about your account of the threat and what you think, as a sovereign state, Ireland should be doing now that it has not been.
Well, I think first of all, it needs to stop free riding in terms of enjoying a security architecture which is gifted from others. It also needs to recognize that the domains have evolved. You no longer have just a land domain, a maritime domain, an air domain. You have a cyber domain and you have a space domain, which require sophistication and capabilities that actually no one country, I believe, can ever provide a total defense architecture. So the way to actually hedge against that then is to actually have a multilateral framework that actually allows you to collaborate with others. And I think that's what we see evolving in the European Union, but also in terms of bilaterals between ourselves and the UK. And I would say at some point in the future, even a transatlantic bilateral in the context of critical infrastructure like submarine cables. I don't agree with the abdication and say that submarine communications cables are private infrastructure, they're the arteries of our success in terms of economy. Trillions of euros of trade are piped through that infrastructure. And if that infrastructure was to collapse, business would collapse. State security is inextricably linked with economic security, which brings me to another vulnerability, which is interconnectors, whether it be gas or whether it be electrical. The reality is that we have evidence that there is an interest in interfering with this infrastructure by foreign states in our jurisdiction. And once again, we have to look at multilateral frameworks to provide that kind of infrastructure, that security architecture and that defense architecture. Just to bring it to one final point, that doesn't necessarily mean that we actually resile from being militarily non-aligned. You can still have the sovereign decision with regards to the application of your defense forces as a sovereign decision. But it has to be, I suppose, recognized that you must be able to interoperate with your neighbors, with your those who hold common values, those on your left and those on your right. At the very least in terms of a UN deployment, but even as a future point of view, whether it be a battle group deployment, we need to be able to communicate and work with other military forces. And to believe we can have a future whereby our military can stay isolated from other militaries is simply not living in reality, where we are effectively interdependent in the context of delivery of defense and security architecture for all of our sovereign states and our sovereign neighbors.
And I mean, that's a very clear answer to the question. I mean, but to press you a bit, are you suggesting that Ireland should contemplate joining NATO? I didn't hear you say that.
No, I didn't. And I have actually personal experience of working very closely with NATO in Afghanistan, where I served as a partnership for peace partner with NATO. And Ireland can actually still into the future carry out those types of roles as a partner with NATO, which actually was at that time operating under a UN mandate. And I often felt that Ireland was in a strong position to be, to some degree, a conscience of NATO in the context of ensuring compatibility with the actions of NATO and the actual mandate from the UN for that particular International Security Assistance Force mission. So there is the ability to actually remain militarily non-aligned, but at the same time to be able to operate with other forces when you have a common agenda that is appropriately institutionalized. And I think, the way Europe now is evolving, its desire for strategic autonomy is actually a clear wake-up call. We recognize the frailty of NATO has been articulated, I think, by Patrick in the context of the threat to Article 5. Europe, while it hasn't in the past had the strategic culture for defense nor the actual military capabilities for defense, it is now moving in that direction with its desire to acquire those capabilities, not instead of NATO, but to actually work in collaboration with NATO into the future.
Patrick.
I think that we tend to forget that the countries which are member states of NATO and member states of the EU are very broadly similar. And they're just operating under different rules, but with the same purpose in mind. And we are, because of that, we find ourselves in a position where we are not full members of NATO, but we are in various practical cooperative schemes with NATO under a Partnership for Peace arrangement or under an EU arrangement. And if those are workable and effective modes of cooperation, okay. We don't need fully to join membership. I think that's where the main question we have to ask. We have to ask people like Mark, is it good enough, the cooperation with NATO states in a NATO context to have arrangements, commitments in terms of specific things like protecting cables, engaging in cooperative work on cyber, which is actually the mode of disruption which gives me most sleepless nights, I think. And we rely on our people who are responsible for that, whether they're military, the guards, whatever they are, to advise us as to whether this mode of cooperation is good enough. And if it isn't, we then have to consider joining a military alliance instead. And that's the key question. But we never get round to that question, I think, in the way we discuss these things. As I say, we are defending something that was traditional and that's people refer to it in glowing terms. It is a contribution to the world. It is helpful to act as a conscience, to have a humanitarian approach. Okay, it is. But you know, small countries which have joined NATO do those things too. It's a matter perhaps of emphasis. If you've a country like Finland, which has almost a sort of total attitude to defense and the threats that surround it. Okay, when they have a rogue Russia next door doing horrible things, they will probably face those questions, and they won't be available for peacekeeping operations. It depends on the circumstances. So that's why I get worried when I see exciting campaigns on the defense of neutrality, which is threatened by the loss of the triple lock. I just see this as a distraction, frankly. If people were jumping up and down and saying, are we actually putting our money where it needs to go in terms of defense, in terms of protecting cables and so on, well and good. It's not so exciting, but it is, I think, more what the sort of general approach which we should be engaged in.
Well, and with that, Eunan, can I just bring you? You made a very compelling case that for much of Irish the history of the state, actually neutrality has been sort of curiously aligned. How recently in sort of public discourse has the definition of neutrality that I think Stephen's advancing been the norm in your view? And then I'd like Stephen to come back because I suspect there may be disagreement.
Well, I would say since Ireland was thinking of joining what's called the common market, you got at the time by critics of the common market from a variety ideological sort of positions, from very sort of conservative Republicans to very leftist Republicans, to people who weren't Republican but saw things in terms of avoiding any kind of engagement with structures which were implicitly Cold War structures, which in some ways the EC emphatically was, because as was mentioned, it was in a sense financed by and promoted by the United States through Marshall aid and so on. So I think certainly by the time I was in college, which is a long time ago, and when I joined in UCD in 1972, neutrality was taken as being the norm, as being a highly moral position. We were very aware of Ireland's military contribution to United Nations peacekeeping and so on. We heard a lot about that. If you read the radical press at the time, anything to, for example, the army were standardizing on small arms with the same as NATO, right, for practical reasons to do with supply and so on. And this was, I think, in Fullblood and elsewhere. The United Irishman was attacked because the argument was, oh, by doing this, you're doing NATO standards, you're trying to join NATO. As time went on, and this is where the great hypocrite, Sean McBride, I particularly take digs at, because he was the one who secretly approached the United States, the great Satan as Minister for External Affairs, to get a secret bilateral deal, which was never done, and that only became apparent through research in the early 1980s. By which time McBride was complete, as it were, peacenik and so on, having also put aside his links with Nazi Germany, which I won't talk about again. And again, NATO has become a kind of a demon. In 1990, which referendum was it, 2002? No to NATO, the Nice referendum. There was a terrific slogan, there were posters outside my house with tanks on them saying no to NATO, no to Nice. There were arguments that you were going to join the European Army, that Ireland would be forced to introduce national service or conscription, as almost all neutrals, ironically, successful neutrals in the 20th century and unsuccessful ones have typically did, including, of course, the Nordic, formerly neutral Nordic states, such as Finland, such as Sweden, but it has over time become completely detached, either from the history, as I would argue it, of the practicalities of how Ireland pursued its defence and security interests and its relationship with the United Kingdom and with North America also, especially with the United States, in practical terms. And it has achieved a kind of a moral sort of righteousness, which simply wasn't there initially for, I would say, for the first, notwithstanding De Valera. De Valera was in some ways, you could say, an idealist international relations, but he was doing that for pragmatic reasons, because you had through the League of Nations, you had through Wilson's 14 points of 1917, you had reasons why it was rational for a small state. Afghanistan is another successful example, although I can't go into it. They joined the League of Nations as soon as they could in 1934, and what they never did was raise any issue to do with their own grievances against either Britain, British Empire, or against Iran in particular, whom they hated, or against the Soviet Union. They avoided insulting or antagonizing their neighbors. They they went with the majority every time, because they calculated small states who want to remain non-aligned. You do it in a sense by adopting an apparently sort of high principled position, but you do that because that's the real politic for small states, not because it's ultimately the most moral thing to do, but because it's a way of staying out of trouble as much as you can for as long as possible.
Stephen, you've been misunderstanding the origins of Irish neutrality. What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, Irish neutrality dates back to 1790, when Theobald Wolfe Tone first wrote his book, The War in Spain, and advocated neutrality as being the right way for Ireland to avoid being dragged into unnecessary wars. Now, we've come a long way since the Nootka crisis, which was the issue in question, but I still think the principle is very relevant. I mean, neutrality...
He went to France then and said to the French, come and help us.
He did, yeah, that's true. But when you're a small country, you can't, I don't know, any port in a storm. I suppose would have been his logic. Anyway, I think that neutrality as defined in the 20th and 21st century is as set out in the Hague Convention of 1907. And interestingly, when Ed Horgan took a case to the High Court in 2003, the court actually agreed that that was continued to describe neutrality in international law. Unfortunately, Ed was unsuccessful because this hasn't been incorporated into Irish domestic law. We haven't incorporated that definition. But I think that there is quite a long-standing definition, and obviously there can be nuances in terms of how it's applied. But the definition as set out in the Hague Convention is essentially, not taking part in other countries' wars, and also not allowing your territory to be used in the wars of in other countries' wars, the wars of belligerents. So that's, I suppose, the tradition that I would argue in favor of. I think that in terms of I think that there was a very good book a number of years ago by a man called James Upcher, who sadly died very young, but it's about neutrality in international law, and it was published, I think, in 2020. But I would recommend it as a very comprehensive scholarly look at how neutrality has developed, the extent to which it's been unchanged, and the extent to which it has been changed by various international developments. The main impact has been the United Nations, because by accepting the Charter of the United Nations, which was originally conceived as being a collective security organization in a way that it never turned out to be, you have to agree, where asked by the Security Council, to support a military operation. Now, it's very, very rare that the Security Council actually does that. Kuwait would be an example. But that's the main way in classical terms that I think neutrality has been modified. And if I might pick up on Patrick's point, I would absolutely appreciate that there are many, there are countries in NATO that have a good humanitarian tradition, but what they don't have is, I mean, Ireland was one of the founding members of the New Agenda Coalition, campaigning for nuclear disarmament at the end of the 90s. Slovenia, I think, was a founding member as well. They had to withdraw because they needed to, in order to be members of NATO. Sweden was also a very important member and had a very long history of nuclear disarmament advocacy. In more recent years, they were forced to withdraw because they were members of NATO. And our affiliation, for example, to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is something that would preclude membership of NATO. It would have to be repealed. And I think that there's a very strong attachment, perhaps to a certain extent due to Sellafield and nuclear issues generally, but there's a very strong attachment to the anti-nuclear stance. It might not be the first thing people think of in the morning, but I think there is quite a strong attachment amongst the Irish people.
I know I want to bring Mark in, because I know you want to respond to that, but just to be really clear, Stephen, when there's a threat that comes to you, that is to say, some of the challenges that we've been hearing described, and it is beyond your means as an individual nation to meet it, in what form of joint enterprise would you advocate response? Because obviously we're, as you rightly say, however well armed, we wouldn't be capable of responding alone. So what's a legitimate form of collective response to a threat that's bigger than our means to meet?
I mean, it's hard to answer in the abstract, because I mean, you can always think of examples where you might be left on your own. For example, let's say we were in NATO, how would you deal with a situation whereby other countries refuse to adhere to Article 5? I mean, could you give maybe a specific example?
Well, I'm thinking about the fibre optic cables. There does seem to be credible grounds for believing that they are at risk, and the defense of them may be more than a single nation, any single nation can meet. So what in your construct is the right mode of collective response?
I don't, I'm not going to pretend I have an easy answer to that, but I don't think that NATO member states are necessarily the best answer. I mean, the Nord Stream pipeline bombing wasn't carried out by Russia, in my opinion anyway, and I think that in the long term, the best thing is to try and reduce the temperature in Europe as much as possible, because we didn't really have these sorts of incidences happening in the obviously there would have been capable, but would have been incidents, but I think that you need to reduce the temperature as much as possible, because whilst it's important that we have fiber optic cables and so forth, none of this approaches the vista that faced President Yeltsin when he woke up in 1995 in January and was told that there was a nuclear missile coming in to hit Moscow, and he had, I think, under the Russian nuclear doctrine, 10 minutes to make a decision as to whether to launch a retaliatory strike. It turned out it was a Norwegian rocket, not a nuclear missile, but by the time they had decided that it was probably not a nuclear missile, he had 2 minutes left. So, if you spend 2 minutes brushing your teeth or whatever, that's how close we came to nuclear war. So that's a threat of a completely different level. I don't claim to have all the answers on the cables, but I think nuclear issue is something that urgently requires as much de-escalation in Europe as possible. And one concrete example of, I suppose, neutral and non-aligned countries working together would be how in the 60s and 70s, you had a specific group of, the 70s and 80s, you had a specific group of non-aligned countries led by Yugoslavia, and which pressed very much for what ended up becoming the Helsinki Final Act and the architecture created by the OSCE. I mean, the OSCE has a court of conciliation and arbitration, which it was amazing to me because I had never heard of it, and which I would say almost no one has heard of, and it's actually never heard a case in its entire history. So what we need to do is actually exhaust those sorts of remedies before always taking the bomb first, ask questions later approach.
Mark, can I put the same question to you? I mean, because you very explicitly said earlier you weren't advocating joining NATO. So what for you is the appropriate collective response?
And similarly with the triple lock, there's Clausewitz said there can be no other way except to subordinate the military to the political. And ultimately that's a political decision, whether Ireland joins NATO or not. And similarly on the triple lock, that's a political decision. And even our discussion around neutrality, that's a political discussion, because unlike Switzerland, which has a constitutional, I suppose, codification for its neutrality, or Austria, as it was articulated, has a treaty. In the case of Ireland, the reality is that we must look at the globalized economy, globalized shared infrastructure that we are now enjoying. And that's very much a factor of the way matters have changed in recent decades. We're no longer an island behind an island. We're part of a network of states in Europe that have been hugely successful because of shared values, because of shared infrastructure, because of a shared economy. And so Ireland, in terms of playing its part, has to look at how best it can position itself to be carrying its weight in this new world. And Stephen mentioned the Hague Conventions of 1907, there is a compelling obligation on states to actually have the wherewithal to prevent its jurisdiction being used by others, by hostiles. And one of the, I suppose, less articulated facts of the intention of the Russian Federation to appropriate 5,000 square kilometers of Irish jurisdiction where it has sovereign rights was a show in the lead up to the invasion of Ukraine, whereby the Russian Federation could demonstrate it could actually bracket Europe with conventional weapons using a task force on the west coast of Ireland, and obviously its intention to invade Ukraine on the east coast of Europe. And that was a message to all of Europe, and it was happening in our jurisdiction, and we couldn't do anything about it. And so we need to look at how we actually work with our partners to ensure our jurisdiction is not being used for malign activities that are actually going to undermine our sovereignty or certainly threaten our neighbours. And that's the world we live in. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for us to invest in our defence forces, which is the obligation on every state to ensure that they can uphold their sovereignty, and to do so in a manner whereby they actually work with their neighbours where possible. If there's a need to share capabilities, they do so in a manner which is about common interests.
I know Misha wants to come in, and then we will have lots of time for questions. How much How much will we have to invest to get close to the capacity that you're describing?
Well, I used to say in the past, what do we know that the rest of Europe doesn't know? We're currently investing the least of the EU 27 in terms of our defence forces, and that needs to change dramatically. I'm delighted to hear, I suppose, first of all, moving to a level of ambition 2, but also an indication of moving to a level of ambition 3 in terms of the report of the Commission on the Defence Forces. But I am certain that you're not going to get there with an investment of 0.2% of our GDP, which is currently approximately what has been invested in defence forces, whereas the NATO norm is 2%, with many states now moving to in excess of 3%. And I think in terms of the EU, a 2% investment in defence is where states should be going if they want to uphold their sovereignty and their sovereign rights.
Really helpful. Misha, how does all this sound to you?
I wanted to make a couple of points very briefly. First of all, to respond to Stephen. Stephen, you can be extremely confident that Russia had nothing to do with blowing up Nord Stream 2. The evidence that it was a Ukrainian/American operation is pretty overwhelming by now. But this issue of the domains of space and of cyber is the really critical issue. Now, the reason why I wanted to highlight things have changed since Trump came into the presidency is that America, the tech bros, Silicon Valley, have embraced a very threatening right-wing agenda that is really important for Europe. We saw what happened in Ukraine when Trump withdrew intelligence sharing with Ukraine temporarily. The key industry there for Ukraine was satellite surveillance by a company called Maxar Technologies. And Maxar conformed, sort of obeyed Trump's instruction within an hour, left the Ukrainians flying blind. Now, Ireland, of all countries, should know just how dependent we are on American companies, American infrastructure, that they are in a position. I had a conversation with the German Interior Ministry about 4 weeks ago, in which I said, do you consider your network structure to be secure? They said it is 100% American, and we are very worried about it. Because America is now playing by different rules. And so when we talk about neutrality, I don't think we're any longer talking about NATO as it was. We're talking about European security here. That's what really concerns me. And I see potentially the United States as being a very difficult player in that European security. I certainly see the Russian Federation as a very difficult player. So what I'm trying to get across is that we are in a fundamentally different world. Now, it may be that neutrality is good, maybe neutrality is bad, but the parameters of the debate have shifted, and we have to recognize that.
Well, thank you. I know we've got lots of questions.
Thank you. My name's Paul Cunningham. I'm political correspondent with RTE, and from time to time, in addition, I travel to war zones. The first one was to Lebanon with the UNIFIL mission. The second was to Bosnia in 1993, and I carried around a book called The Fall of Yugoslavia by a certain Misha Glenny. And thankfully, the plagiarism maps that exist today didn't exist in 1993. Otherwise, I might have to pay you a rather large check for the references that were made in the book. I agree with your analysis in relation to how things have changed today when you talk about Vladimir Putin and also Donald Trump, who continues to cause both chaos but also direction at the same time. I'm just wondering if it is going to be as acute in a year's time as it is now. Maybe the air will pull out of the balloon if it is the case that some analysts say Russia's only got another year economically to sustain this war, and equally in another year Donald Trump will be in the midterm elections. And then maybe if it is the case that it isn't as acute next year as it is this year, then the big debate we're having might seem to be less of a debate.
It's an important point to make. There are several key unknowns in the war between the conflict between Ukraine and Russia at the moment. We started off with a war which looked similar to the First World War, with the trench warfare and the tanks and so on. We've now leapfrogged into the 21st century, where we are looking at a drone war. The Ukraine's cyber defenses have been pretty effective. They've been assisted by the British, by the Americans, by the Canadians, and by the Estonians in particular. And so far they've held out, although there are real fears in Ukraine that the Russians might secure on the ground a breakthrough fairly soon, and that would tilt the balance very much in favor of Russia. The economy has proved in Russia to be pretty successful so far, given the enormity of the sanctions that have been placed on them. But you know, when autocracies and dictatorships crumble, they crumble very suddenly and very quickly, without necessarily any long preamble to it. And this is what Donald Rumsfeld would have called a known unknown in the context of Russia. So yes, that's true. In the United States, I think things are slightly different. It's true that the midterms may well have a significant influence on how America goes forward. But remember, and this is bipartisan, that America sees as its great competitor China. Everything else is subordinate to that competition. Now that the tech bros have got involved in politics, forget about the spat between Musk and Trump, forget about him wanting to put a man on Mars. Look and see what he's doing with Starlink and SpaceX. 7,000 satellites in low Earth orbit. The nearest competitor to that is Eutelsat with 634 satellites. What he has done with Starlink since the Trump administration is persuade the Federal Communications Commission to allow him to use Starlink for mobile telephony inside the United States, in the teeth of resistance from Verizon and AT&T. What Teal is doing with Palantir and Admiral, apart from hoovering up large amounts of data from government contracts and private contracts, including organizations like the National Health Service, is to move into the defense industry. And what Teal and Musk, in my opinion, and some of their colleagues around them, are really aiming at is the doctrine articulated first by Brent Scowcroft and then later on again in the George W. Bush administration, total information awareness. And they're doing this in competition with China, who are beginning to develop very effective hypersonic missiles, which are capable also of disrupting satellite networks as well. And so for the US, this is the overwhelming priority. And if Europe gets in the way of these priorities, the US will engage in a hostile manner with Europe, in my opinion. The fact that Friedrich Merz persuaded the Bundestag to lift the debt brake, specifically in order to invest in military, that speaks volumes. That means that Europe is frightened, and I think there's a good reason for Europe to be frightened at the moment.
just before we go to the next question, Mark, do you agree with that from a military point of view?
Yeah, I think what has been in the crosshairs is Article 5, and that's a concern to Europe from the point of view of the commitment of the US to respond. So therefore, exactly, I think as Misha has said, Europe has to stand up and build its own architecture, however that is constructed, so that it has that strategic autonomy, which I accept is a French doctrine, but I do think it makes sense. And it's not just about defense, it's about energy, it's about a whole architecture whereby Europe has the wherewithal to operate in an autonomous manner as a collective. And I'm not just talking about the EU, but I'm talking about the EU and its European neighbours.
We talk about neutrality in black and white terms. If we're not neutral, it means we're going to join the NATO or some other alliance, we're going to go to war. It doesn't mean that. And the complaint I have, and I thank you two for bringing this up here, I would love us to have a proper debate about this and let the people decide. I'm a Democrat. Let the people decide, but they must explain to them what neutrality means. Switzerland, Austria and Sweden, the billions they spent on defending their countries as neutrals. But if you've ever been to the Nordic countries, notwithstanding they were neutral, they talked about Russia all the time. Russia, Russia, Russia. And that's their history. We talk about the Brits all the time, our history, okay. So, I have two questions. I'm coming to it, okay. So, isn't this over, this neutrality? Because it doesn't mean we're going to join NATO. It doesn't mean we're going to join the Americans. It doesn't necessarily mean, it may end up in a particular mission down the road, we will do something. Point one. Second point, and in the context of the government having to protect its people.
Yeah.
Second point, haven't the people in this country already voted this question? And I refer you to Article 42(7) of the Treaty on the Function of the European Union, which says, if a member state is the victim of an aggression, armed aggression by another state, that we will go in and assist that member state.
Well, thank you. Because we've got multiple questions, I would like to give people time. But Stephen, maybe that's a good one for you. Have the people not already spoken on this?
Well, they have spoken in 2002 and 2009 when they voted in favour of the referendums on the clear understanding that the triple lock would be maintained. On that quite specific point about the Treaty of European Union, I'm trying to remember now, when Croatia acceded to the European Union, there was a new treaty that was put in place by the heads of state and government. This was the opportunity, this was I think in 2013, this was the opportunity to follow up on the Lisbon Treaty, because a commitment was given at the time of the referendum that there was going to be the National Declaration, but that there would also be a follow-up treaty amongst the heads of state and government when a new member joined, and it turned out to be Croatia. That set out, as far as I'm aware, quite clearly that any attack on any EU member state, how exactly Ireland or any other country would respond would be a matter for them to decide. So I don't agree that triggers a NATO-style one all for one, one for all type clause. I think that one thing that has been completely, not really touched on is the role of the Global South in international security, because the Global South is somewhere where I think they have quite, in many cases, quite strongly asserted neutrality. They have declined to take part in Western sanctions against Russia, and I think that if they had acceded to Western sanctions, Russia's invasion would have collapsed probably in a matter of days. So the increased unwillingness of the Global South to go along with what the EU and NATO would like them to do is a major factor that has to be taken into account and addressed.
Mark, do you want to come back on?
Yeah, I think the issue, and in the context of the 42(7), in the aftermath of the Bataclan, Ireland was asked to look at the resources it could allocate in terms of missions in Africa. And it did just that, but it made a choice. And I think that's a potential future, whereby ultimately, in the context of its collaboration with France in that particular case, it made a choice to actually allocate resources to mitigate the effect of France having to consolidate domestically.
Rohan Radia from the British Embassy. Thank you. It's been really interesting to hear different sides of this debate. And forgive me because I'm relatively new to Ireland. So a couple of questions, but I will be quick. Number one is there seems to be an overlap between the idea of neutrality and demilitarization. And what I mean by that is mainly directed towards Stephen. For those who are very in favor of neutrality, it seems to be a sort of a lack of, or neutrality means that Ireland probably shouldn't invest so much in its security and its military. And I wonder why that's the case. Could it be the case that Ireland can maintain its neutrality but invest in its military like Sweden and Finland did prior to joining NATO? And my second question is, the Taoiseach has talked quite a lot about solidarity with those in Central Europe and Eastern Europe who are EU member states, especially following February 2022. For example, the Baltics. Do you buy that argument that Ireland should be investing more in its military and collective defence in solidarity with its allies? And I can guarantee the Baltic states would probably say that Ireland, the best they could ask of Ireland is military investment as opposed to just diplomatic.
Stephen, and then perhaps we might ask Eunan to respond on that.
I mean, the answer to the first question is yes, you can be neutral and spend a large amount of money on defence. That was the approach during the Cold War of Finland, Austria, and Switzerland in particular. So I don't think there's any dispute about that. They had enormous militaries, particularly their reserves, taking them into account, ran into the hundreds of thousands. In the case of Finland, for example, and for a long time, long before they joined NATO, they had conscription and compulsory service and so forth. So you can. As to whether you want to is a separate thing. My sense is that I think that Switzerland's approach to armed neutrality is the right policy for Switzerland. And I think that our geographical position does make us very, very different. So I think that a case has been made out. I mean, there's issues, the issue was raised in the past about primary radar and so forth. My view is that that is a legitimate area for more defense spending. I think that the issue of cybersecurity is an area where there's a need for targeted investment. The difference is that I don't see that as being a military area, quite frankly. I think that's a law enforcement area. But one thing that has to be confronted is that really, I mean, even those who do favour much increased defence spending have to accept that there's very little public appetite, and there's certainly no public appetite for a 2%, 3%, 5%, I can't really keep track of what it is, NATO level spending. And I think it's very wrong to be, I completely disagree with apportioning our defence based on the GDP level. Obviously, you have the distorting issue of multinationals in Ireland in particular, which means it's not a great idea. And I just think that it creates a completely perverse incentive to be benchmarking your defence on how much you're going to be spending, giving to arms companies, because that creates an incentive. It disincentivizes civil servants from seeking to procure the best contracts because they're just given a huge amount of money that they have to spend. I think that as regards the Baltic states, I really would think that more or less the last thing on their mind would be what Ireland spends to, protect the Ring of Kerry or wherever. I think that's rather remote from their concerns. I think that the best thing we can do is to try and reduce the temperature and reduce the tensions in Europe. That's no guarantee of peace, but I think that's the best thing that we can do.
Can I just put in a point of information? From the comments here, people seem to think that Austria is some armed camp. Austria spends very little money on defence, just over 1%. I know that pales in comparison with Ireland. It doesn't have a big arms industry. It's specifically not able to have a big arms industry. It does have a small arms industry, Glock pistols, basically. And Steyr. Steyr, but it's not on the scale of Bofors and Saab and the Swedish defense industry.
I'd like to address this to Misha, whoever really wants answered, I suppose. My name is Fiacre, I'm 17 years old. And to me, I see a future of EU militarization. And personally, I wouldn't like to get sent off anywhere myself, fighting a war that I don't really care about. So I'm just kind of wondering, you know, what's the future of that for me, and what should Ireland's response be to this, you know, these increased policies of militarization within the EU? You see it with Germany, investment in the Bundeswehr, you know, record numbers joining the British Army. And it's, you know, it's scary to me, but I think, you know, should there be a response? Should there be a unified response to all these new policies that are being implemented?
Misha, do you want to respond on that, and then?
Yeah, I mean, you know, as again, I want to try and reiterate what I'm saying is that security is changing in many ways. If you're in Eastern Europe, certainly if you're in Ukraine, obviously, also the Baltic states, there is this great fear of the Russian Federation. I have to say that personally, I do not believe that the Russian Federation aims to march through Ukraine and then march through the Baltic states. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that the Russian Federation is actually, its military has been rather badly exposed by Ukraine. It was meant to, the wide-held assumption was, and certainly by Putin, was that he would clear up all of Ukraine within 4 days. And yet within 3 days, they became completely bogged down because of their substandard material.
We're fortunate on the point of changing world orders to have somebody who is a historian of moments of change in world orders. So can I give the last question to John Horn?
Well, thank you very much, Simon, and thanks to all the panel for a wonderful discussion. I mean, my question is this, and I just want to perhaps try to combine, if this is then the last question, the kind of the horizontal view, as you put it, of Misha Glenny, totally accepting the dramatically changed circumstances that we're now in, but also the vertical view, the historical view, which Eunan O'Halpin gave us. And it does seem to me that in the discussion, specifically as it relates to Ireland, there's been this really interesting conflation of the debate on neutrality and the debate on armed security. And it's as if in the Irish case, and that's my question to you, why is this so? In the Irish case, that the debate on neutrality has become, as Eunan explained, a kind of cipher for the debate on military strength, military security. And now that's crucially important in the changed context in which we find ourselves. Is one of the keys to the explanation for this the point that Eunan made at the start, which is that neutralities have very different origins and trajectories, and that the Irish neutrality is one of separatism. It's one of dissociating itself from what has come to be seen, what was an imperial, a colonial power, and that's very different to Swiss, Austrian, Finnish, Swedish neutrality. It's very distinct. And in that case, it seems to me that, is it, or let me put it as a question, is it the case that in Ireland what we have is no culture of militarism? In fact, a kind of culture of anti-militarism which is connected with our sense of national identity. We have cultures of paramilitarism, that's something else, but not of militarism. And therefore, if that's so, does that help explain why it's so difficult to have the debate, which Patrick, you were calling for, to have this kind of clear debate on where we go with increasing security in the changed environment without necessarily entailing the kind of frightening lurch into militarism that I think you were evoking in your question, and I would absolutely share that. Let me put it like this. Is disentangling neutrality from the need for military security perhaps the last stage in our own decolonization?
A great way of putting it. And the subject for a history festival or two, but can we start with Eunan and work back this way, and I'll leave the final word with Misha. But Eunan, is that the right way of formulating the question?
I think it is, but I think we have to add to it. The main function of the Irish Defence Forces since 1922 has been to uphold the authority and legitimacy of the state internally. And that means that the defence issues in terms of debate, the Defence Forces in particular, if it weren't for the Defence Forces, we wouldn't have a functioning democracy now, right? The internal threat, the aspirations of the Republican movement, including Mr. Adams, until the mid-1980s, they claimed the IRA was the legitimate government as well as the legitimate army of the Irish Republic. So they absolutely denied the legitimacy of this state. And we forget that at our peril. And the reason that they didn't win wasn't simply because of the peace process and inviting people to the White House, who weren't, of course, in the IRA. But it was because in this state, the state stood up, and they stood up through the Gardaí, yes, but also through the fact of having a functioning defence force, which, however ill-equipped, however, almost absent in the air and on the sea and under the sea, but was strong enough and disciplined enough to maintain the integrity of the state internally from a very serious internal threat. And there is a hatred of the defence forces within what you might call conventional Irish republicanism today, precisely because in terms of state stability, the defence forces won that battle. Thank you.
Stephen, is ours a neutrality of separatism?
I wouldn't phrase it in that way, no. It's about independence. And we've always opposed an isolationist model of neutrality. We advocate for positive neutrality. But I mean, I would strongly back what Misha Glenny said about the Russians being shown up by how the invasion has panned out. I mean, there's a great deal, I feel, of threat inflation. And one recent talking point that is very popular is how Russia is spending X enormous proportion of their GDP on defense and so forth. I mean, that's certainly true, but what is rarely pointed out is the fact that, Russia's overall economy is the same size as the economy of Italy. It's nowhere near what the former Soviet Union was. So there's a need for proportion. I think that President Putin expected, he got elected as president. He was first acting president. He got elected as president on the back of the war in the Second Chechen War and, the offensive on Grozny. He had then in 2016, the Aleppo, and I think that he felt that this was going to be a short military victory which would make him extraordinarily popular, and he was proven devastatingly wrong. I think that the militarization of Europe is something we've always opposed, and I think that one of the greatest threats is, the point was made about the far right. I mean, the Reichsbürger movement in Germany is a movement that actually seeks to overthrow German democracy, and far from being a sort of fringe movement, it's had thousands of adherents, including many people in positions of power. So that's an ongoing threat to Germany, which is the EU's principal economic power. So European countries need to keep their own house in order as well.
Patrick, have you brief final comments?
Well, I still end up with the view that we are tending to fuss over a footnote of our history in terms of this business of the triple lock. I think that we should be more aware that the EU is as much at stake as the defense of Ireland, because the EU is our economic environment, which has been very helpful to us, and it is very fragile in many ways, the EU. And then we have to continue what has been started in terms of getting a serious military capability to deal with what is under the sea mostly, but also this is a question of cyber. And the technologies, the military technologies have changed. The geopolitics is in the middle of change, and we are having to deal with unfriendly states, which we're used to regarding as being part of our center of our civilization. The United States has gone rogue, and that has to be taken seriously into account.
Thank you. Mark, what would you add to that?
I think there are, I suppose, a reality that for 100 years we've been sea blind. We've had a very land-centric view on the security of the state for reasons articulated earlier on by Eunan, because that's where the threat was. We've suddenly realized that now we've actually lodged claims for almost 1 million square kilometers of sea area where we have sovereignty or sovereign rights over the seabed and sub-seabed resources out to the extent of the continental shelf. And we've also discovered, Eureka, actually there's a critical infrastructure there that has existed unbeknownst to us for decades, that is actually part of the engine that's been successful in the economy. That is what keeps our FDIs coming in terms of the Googles and the Intels and all the rest. That's critical infrastructure in terms of communications cables. And now we need to invest in that architecture in a broader sense. And we also need to recognize we're not on our own. We have neighbors around us that are actually dependent on this infrastructure functioning correctly.
Misha, has anything surprised you in what you've heard?
No, I've been learning a lot about Ireland and neutrality, which is I'll be honest, I'm much more familiar with the Austrian and the Finnish and Swedish situations. What it has taught me is that, or what it's underlined, is my fundamental belief of Europe's position in the current situation is that at the moment this is the only continent where there is still a clear political majority for a set of values based on the Enlightenment and based on the principles of liberal democracy. And there's not much we can compete with these days. We do have economic power. We have very limited political power, and crucially, unfortunately, we are very weak as technological powers. To compensate for that, we need greater unity within Europe, certainly on the political level. But I would also, as the fundamental lesson for me about this discussion as well, is recognizing where vulnerability lies and what security is in the age of artificial intelligence. We haven't even mentioned artificial intelligence yet, but believe you me, the world is about to change even quicker than it has been in the past 20 to 25 years. And everyone needs to try and understand what the implications are for Europe and its security.
Well, thank you. I think in your different ways, you've all been Stakhanovite today, Stakhanovite of festivals, Misha having come directly from Boris. Eunan, I think this is probably the 4th West Cork History Festival that you've been to in one form or another, if not the 5th, so thank you for that. Stephen, for stepping in and I think articulating your position so clearly, so powerfully at the very last minute. Thank you for that. Patrick, equipped, I think, with repaired hearing aids from this morning. You wouldn't have known. You've sailed straight into it, and thank you very much indeed. And Mark, pessimistic and pragmatic, but you've managed to sustain us and bring real insight from the military sphere. So thank you all very much. And thank you to all of you for sticking it out. And we look forward to seeing those of you who can back in the real capital on the 9th of August. It won't be quite such a long session, but thank you all for coming.